I was trying to figure out with every group, I just, I make an effort to speak a bit differently, give a different angle. But I thought it'd be interesting, after all you've gone through, is to speak a little bit about Israeli society from the perspective of the President of Israel. President Rivlin, who is a very unique individual, and unfortunately lost his wife this week, I don't know if you heard, it was a big thing. And I had the privilege, I don't know how, we were really enamored with each other, and I had the privilege to speak about her, about Nechama Rivlin, quite a bit. But the thing about these people is that, President Rivlin comes from Likud, he comes from the right wing. But when he came into into the president's mansion, he understood that he needs to speak about Israeli society in a different way than we have spoken about it before. Israeli society, now that we are 71, is very different than the society we started off. When we came to Israel in 1948, well, basically you should know something about my roots. My great-great-grandparents came to Israel in 1777. Okay, so this is how long we're here. Even my paternal grandparents came in 1933 from Thessalonica. So it's before the foundation of Israel and before we got our independence. But the thing is that in 1948, we weren't even remotely close to 500,000 people here. Nowadays, we are going strongly on 9 and a little bit more than 9 million people. But the thing is that for many, many years we spoke about Israel. People who came from Yemen and people who came from Poland, people who came from Germany and people who came from Iraq. We spoke about something that is very popular in America to speak about, and that is the melting pot. But nowadays, as the president says, we should speak about the tribes. And we have different tribes, and if I would elaborate about that, I would even go to sub-tribes. But the tribes that the president mentioned, and we should even take the fifth one that he speaks about, but the 4 tribes are the secular society, the religious Zionists, the ultra-Orthodox, whom you probably know from America. They make a point of dressing differently. They have they're much more isolated societies. And the non-Jews, which is mainly the Arab, the Druze, the Cherkess here in Israel. But even if you go into secular tribe, for instance, you would have subgroups in the secular tribes. Because, for instance, I define myself as being traditional. I don't observe Judaism, but my son was bar mitzvahed in December, and it was very important for me that he would be bar mitzvahed in an Orthodox synagogue. What does it even make a difference? I'm Israel, I'm Jewish, I'm Jewish by definition. But it still made a point. My aunt, who really observes absolutely nothing, said something very interesting. She said that when we hold ceremonies, we are Orthodox. This is a very interesting to look about it when you feel that you're very, very well connected with your Jewish roots. Now, if you go to the classic definition of left and right, usually it would be the left are less connected to being traditional or to being Jewish or to being, they would be more, the synonym would be more liberal, more openness, less religious. It's not necessarily so. That's the thing about Israel. That's the thing about the tribes. If you go to the right wing, they would usually define themselves also through their Jewish definition. But the thing and the trick about Israel, and this is why the tribes definition is so important, is that we are both Jewish and democratic, exactly as the Declaration of Independence said of Israel, being the Jewish state as well as a democratic state. Now the thing and the challenge that we have nowadays is to make sure that they don't clash, is that they still find the way to remain together, because there is no other state in the world that defines itself through its religion. Our nationality derives from our religion. This is not the usual thing. When you look to countries nowadays that are more associated with nationalism, and I speak now unfortunately about nationalism in the bad sense, okay? They would usually not define themselves through Christianity. There would be a total separation of state and religion. Mostly I'm speaking about Eastern Europe, where nationalism is truly raising its, I don't know if it's ugly head. I hope it won't raise its ugly head, but I'm very, very concerned about it, okay? nationalism in Israel is a very, very interesting question, also related with the question of the tribes. Because nationalism is in Israel, and that is a very, very crucial vector. I'm a national person. I'm left-wing. I'm a national person. I'm concerned about the security of Israel, and I'm a national person. I'm very, very democratic. I'm very concerned with the democratic foundations of Israel, but I'm a national person. So who are you? And when you would go to the right wing, if you have met, I don't know if you meet this time around, if you have an opportunity to meet someone from the right wing, they would definitely define themselves through the issue of nationalism. I'm not sure. Well, they would probably also say, democracy is very important, but they might define themselves through the question of nationalism. Because in Israel, again, our nationality is Jewish. There is no such thing as Israeli nationality. Yet, having said that, a lot of the Arabs might not define themselves as Zionists. This is the Zionist movement who brought the Jews over here. Thank God. But they might be patriots. They would have their own narrative, but they would want to blend in. They would want to work in high tech. You probably heard about the Israeli high tech, and you probably know that Israel is like the second country in the world to be with companies in NASDAQ, which is amazing. This is a 9 million people state. I work with countries because my grandparents came from Greece, and I was the head of the parliamentary group of Israel in Greece. Greece is 11 million people. Okay, and this is the birth of democracy comes from Greece. Okay, but no other country in the world had the ability to do what we do here. So the main question is, how do you maintain that? How do you keep it going on? So it's interesting. I don't know if you heard about the nation-state law. We have passed in the Knesset, and I'm saying we have passed in the Knesset, even though my fraction has decided to vote against it. A nation-state law. We have the Declaration of Independence. Okay, it's very, very clear. Equality is well blended in. There's no question, no differences of race, religion, or sex, or gender. Nothing. It's very, very obvious that equality is a part of it. Do we need a nation-state law? Do we need a law that says that Israel is the state of the Jewish people? This is a question that I would answer very differently if I'm being interviewed in an Israeli newspaper or any other media source. And it would be different when I'm speaking to groups coming from America or coming from Europe, or when I went over to speak in parliaments, my answer would be different. We voted against it because we thought that having a nation-state law without equality, well blended in, is a big, big, big mistake. Why was the government, headed by Likud, so much against equality? Their point was that we have other fundamental legislations that include equality in them. So it's not necessary to have that in the nation-state law. But there is something to be declared when it comes to equality in a place like Israel with all the tribes that we have. Sometimes it's fascinating to see, by the way, in the Knesset, to see the alliances between the ultra-Orthodox and the Arabs. They have, I would call, the alliance of the underprivileged, of the ones that are feeling sometimes left out from the employment market, sometimes by their own choice, sometimes left out because they don't serve in the army. Both groups don't serve in the army unless they volunteer. So it's very, very interesting to point it out. Going back to the nation-state law, I said that day, to the media, I said I would vote against it while crying. Because for me, it's not natural. When Israel is celebrating its 70th birthday, it's not natural for me, as a person with my ideology, to vote against the nation-state law, against the law that says that Israel is the Jewish people's state, without any question. But the reason I did vote against it came from the wrong motivation. The motivation, for instance, we would tell them, being the opposition, we would tell them, bring on the Declaration of Independence and let's make it into a law. But they're afraid of it. That's why, by the way, this is the same reason why Israel will, well, I don't want to say never, but chances are that we will not have a constitution because of the tribes. Because we are groups that are not meant to be a melting pot. We are groups that are meant to be an Israeli salad. Do you know what an Israeli salad is? You should try it, by the way. The Israeli salad would be vegetables that are all cut, not very, very small, but in small pieces, and they are separated in the salad, and then you mix it all up. But the idea is that each vegetable still has its own taste, its own history, its own language, its own culture. It's the same about the Jews who came from Ethiopia and the Jews who came from Russia. They should be allowed, and I'm talking about it in the freer concept of allowed, that we should embrace those differences. And we don't always excel in that. We don't, every country has its issues with bigotry and racism, and in a place like Israel, when you are in a constant conflict anyway, not just within yourself, but also from the outside. Again, going back to the nation-state law, when I would go outside of Israel, when I would speak to groups like you, it's interesting. It's like, it's not a switch in my mind, but it's true. When I went to parliaments this past year and a half, I can tell you that things that were obvious once upon a time are not that obvious anymore. It was very, very obvious that Israel is the state of the Jewish people. But all of a sudden you meet parliamentarians from other countries in the world, and you see that this is not as obvious, because from their perspective, well, you have the Arabs here, so they should have national rights also. But the thing is, it's not true. They have civil rights, absolutely. They are citizens of Israel. They're allowed to every right that I'm allowed, by the way, in spite of the fact that they don't hold the same duties that I do. Because for me, it's not a question. When I was 18, I went to do the army. When my husband was 18, he went to do the army. When my kids will turn 18, they will go into the army. There's no question about it in our house. My husband, I was just speaking to Benjamin and Rosita about it. It's very interesting. The army is still a part of our house. My husband is 52 and still serves in the Special Forces Command. Because there's no question on his part, that he should still go to reserve duty because he's still needed. It's the same here. By the way, there is a fascinating story about my husband. Sorry to drag family in, but I think this is a good opportunity to do that. My husband used to work with Shimon Peres, and he was actually a part of the negotiations team, the security negotiations team of the Oslo Accords, which were signed in 1992. And in 2002, we got married. And we had the wonderful, wonderful privilege of going to America for our honeymoon. When we came back, my husband had a special order on the door saying that he's required in Jenin because we had armored shield operation was going on. So less than 24 hours after we came from our honeymoon, my husband was in his tank overall in Jenin. The fascinating thing, when he came back, at that point he was still in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs with Shimon Peres as his advisor. And he wrote an article speaking about his 2 suits in Jenin, because he used to go to Jenin almost on a weekly basis in order to find, to create joint projects with the Palestinians, because we're way after the Oslo Accords were signed. But there was no question in his heart, if he has to go to Jenin to eliminate nests of terrorists, there's no question on his part, there's no question on our part. And like in the movies, he came for 24 hours, he came after about 2.5 weeks, he came home for 2.5 hours. I went with my brother to pick him up, and it was like in the movies, he was all covered in dust, and he walked towards me, truly like a film made in Hollywood. But the thing is, being left-wing people, we don't make a mistake. We know that Israel, we know it, it's a core thing that This is not just the state of the Jewish people. And and it's very, very important for us to make sure that everybody who lives here gets his own, gets civil rights. There's no question about it. But the thing is, how do you create, with this situation, having all these threats around you, how do you create the inner unity within the tribes? This is, by the way, it's important to remember, unity doesn't mean unanimous. Unity doesn't mean that you always agree. Unity is usually, it would be from the very, very important perspective that everyone is allowed to have their own opinion. But the thing is that we are now in the territory since Six Days War. It's 52 years, and you ask yourself the question of the future, and this is something I think that left-wing people, and I would probably be called, when I call myself left here, everybody outside who's really left are laughing, because I'm not considered to be left in Israel. I do think myself of a left-wing person, but I would probably, the more accurate definition would be extreme centrist, okay? Israel is not well built for black and white. This is not a country for black and white. This is a country for a variety of colors, in between. And there are a lot of colors in between. So the thing is, how do we, 71 years to our existence, and 52 years after 6 Days War, with all these different perspectives within us, how do we create this inner unity within the tribes in order to make sure that we're here in 200 years, in 300 years, with all these exogenic threats? Because that's one of the things that I think people who don't live here don't really understand. There is no other conflict in the world which suffers from the same characteristics, okay? This is not just a conflict, I'm mainly speaking obviously about the conflict with the Palestinians, even though, and with that I give Netanyahu credit, he's trying to bypass this conflict in order to create other regional alliances, by the way, one of which I'm a very strong part of, the alliance, the Mediterranean alliance, which is Israel, Greece, Cyprus, Egypt, quite a bit. I'm actually having all these ambassadors in my house in 2 weeks, okay? So there's great potential there. So you're like trying to bypass the problem, but can we really bypass it? My perspective is that we will not be able to bypass it. Eventually, we will need to find a solution. And this is where the conflict stands nowadays. As a left-wing person, it's very hard for me to see how we can go to the two-state solution anytime soon. I think that this belief is very, very deep. I think the Palestinian Authority is very weak. We have the territories, we have Judea and Samaria, and we have Gaza, which is very, very difficult to solve between Palestinian Authority, between Fatah and Hamas. And obviously we have all the, I would say, the more serious threat, even though this is also a serious threat from my perspective. If you know anything at all about what's going in the Gaza perimeter, you know what's been going on there with Palestinians rushing over to the fence. Even though we went out, we withdrew from Gaza, okay? So the Israeli people who live there are having quite a hard time, especially for the past year. Balloons with ammo being sent on a daily basis. But the thing is that we will have to solve this issue because we would have to separate from the Palestinians. Another reason that we would have to do that is because it's our interest. It's not in their interest, it's in our interest to separate from the Palestinians eventually, because if we want to make sure that Israel remains Jewish and democratic state. And this is where it's interesting, because the conflict, even though it is very clear even to a lot of people on the left wing that it's very difficult to create a two-state solution, to get to it anytime soon, this kind of conflict, which I wanted to speak about, its special characteristics. Let me just go back a little bit. Why does it have special characteristics? Because it's both national and religious conflict. No other conflict in the world suffers from the same characteristics, not in South Africa, not in Ireland, not in other places in Africa. They have a claim, and this is a big question. Okay, if we went out of Kalkilia and Nablus and Ramallah, we went out of it. But is it enough for them? Is it enough for them to give up on the dream to go back to Jaffa, for instance, to go back to Akko? Is it enough? And this is a big question. I mean, will they be able to give up on, on that dream, because we will not get out of Jaffa. We will not get out of Akko. Okay? We will not get out of Ashkelon. So this is one big question. Will they be able to give it up? And the other question is the fundamentalism in Islam. I was very privileged to be, this would amaze you probably, but well, it amazes people in politics in Israel. I was the first member of parliament in the faction, in the labor faction, okay, to have a political advisor who's Arab. He's a Bedouin from up north, a very talented young man. I was very, very proud to have him as an advisor. But it amazed me that I was the first one to ever have an Arab political advisor. Now, these are the people who I mentioned earlier. They can be patriots in the sense they're not Zionists. Well, I never asked them the question, are you Zionist, okay? I should say that a lot of the non-Jews in Israel serve in the army and serve in the police. A lot of them are Christians. Some of them are Muslims. All the Druze, which is about 120,000 people, they all serve in the army. Not the women, which I will get to soon, but the men all serve in the army, and unfortunately really paid a very high price. Obviously in life we keep speaking about the alliance of the dead, but this is the alliance of the living. This is what we should be working at, okay? By the way, the Druze were the community that was most offended by the nation-state law, by it not including equality in it. And this is why we should find a way to come to terms with it. It is legislation that is necessary nowadays, unfortunately, vis-a-vis countries around the world, vis-a-vis politics around the world. When anti-Semitism, and you've been to Auschwitz, when anti-Semitism becomes anti-Israeli, we don't have any other choice. And this is what it has become. In September, I went to speak in the Labour Party in England. Do you know what's going on there? Labour Party in England, now this is like a sister party to my party, okay? A sister party. And it has a head who is totally anti-Semitic. The Jewish community in Great Britain is going through the hardest time, I think, for many, many, many years. I don't think they've had a harder experience than having Jeremy Corbyn as a real valid candidate for being Prime Minister. And I spoke there, obviously. I went to the Labour Party conference on the invitation of the Labour Friends of Israel, and I spoke against Jeremy Corbyn and his cabinet. You know, they have a shadow cabinet. Now, this is a serious thing in England. So I spoke against them because it was very, very clear to me that their anti-Semitism is anti-Israeli. Now, I don't know which derives from what. Anti-Israeli becomes anti-Semitism or the other way around. I have no idea. But it goes to prove that we don't have another choice but to have a nation-state law. But we should, having said that, we should know how to be more inclusive and to understand that we need those communities, those tribes to feel together. Again, unity doesn't mean unanimous. And this is a very important thing. I want to tell you a little bit about women in Israel because I think it's very, very interesting. You know that in 1948, women in Israel were a part of the army. They were holding all sorts of positions. We have had a fighter pilot as early as the 1960s, Yael Rom. My grandmother, who was born in Israel in 1942, was drafted, well, she drafted herself, obviously, to the British Army. She was driving lorries, huge lorries, in the Egyptian desert for 3 years by herself, with ammunition, with people, whatever you wanted. By herself. She was alone, a woman alone, but she was unique. But that was the thing, by the way, the ATS, which was a battalion of only women, in which the British Queen served in as well. You know, there was no question as to women's abilities. And all of a sudden, the Israeli state was founded. And sometimes it sounds to me a little bit like World War II in America and in Europe, you know, when women were holding all the positions that the men were holding while they were out in combat, and when they came back, the women had to go back into the kitchen. Now in Israel, the gender general conversation is very, very strong. On the one hand, it's very, very obvious. Most banks in Israel are now headed by women. Most banks. Now, we don't have as many as you have. We have about 6. But this is a small country, as pointed out. But at least they have, one of them has both women, CEOs and chairman of the board. Most of them have at least one of the position being held by a woman, okay? And I'm talking about the big banks, as well as the smaller ones. So a lot of the financial system has very, very strong major women. We don't have that many women board members, unfortunately. The percentage, we are neck to neck with America in that respect. In America, the rates are also quite low. I came from the business sector into politics. So it was only natural for me, I would mostly be with men in the board, but I would mostly be the one and only woman in the room. But it's interesting to see that even in America, still nowadays, the percentage is around 20, 24%, not much more than that. I'm talking about, obviously, about listed companies. We are still struggling with work-life balance. In Israel, the working hours are very, very long. We are, in order to really, in order to make real progress in the employment market, you need to basically work all hours of the day. And that is a very, very, big challenge. In Israel, which is very different in that respect from Europe, I don't remember the percentage of birth, the birth rate in America. But the birth rate in Israel is crazy, guys, okay? If you want big families, come to Israel. We are, and now I'm talking about not about ultra-Orthodox and not about Arabs, which birth rate has gone down. In the ultra-Orthodox, it's still it's about six or 7 kids per family. But in this secular community, it's almost 3 children per family. And so these are the aloof people, usually higher education. I mean, this is fascinating. Now, why is it? First of all, it's a very good thing, by the way. It's a very good thing for our children, because I keep thinking, in all my activities, my main thought is, okay, what kind of state are we going to be living to our children? Now, this is a challenge, by the way, because we don't have that much land. It's a small country. I don't know if you had a chance to see, maybe through the maps, but the waist of Israel is very, 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 very narrow. That's why the question of the 2-state solution is such a challenge, because basically there's no leeway. There's no. So birth rate here is very high. So, and most families nowadays would have at least 2 working parents. But the middle class in Israel, as around the world, by the way, as in America and as in Europe, is quite in a big struggle, because the cost of living in Israel is quite high. Isn't it amazing that Tel Aviv is one of the most expensive cities in the world to live in? It's like, this is not Tokyo, this is not London, it's not New York, it's not Washington, but this is like a hub where people want to come and enjoy themselves, and it has become one of the most expensive cities to live in the world. It's fascinating, this is for somewhere in the Middle East. Sometimes it really amazes me. By the way, I was born and raised in Tel Aviv, okay? So this is really my beloved city. It's beautiful. I hope you're going to have a chance to get a real glimpse of its beauty, because when you're coming, on the shoreline, always, when a city has this beautiful beach, it always looks nice. But the thing about Tel Aviv is that it has a lot of hidden architecture. This is like a Bauhaus capital of the world. It's UNESCO's one of the it's treasure when it comes to world architecture. And usually people don't speak about Tel Aviv in those terms, but I always go in Tel Aviv and I'm almost 49, so it's been many, many years that I've been walking around like that. So I'm going back to women. So the work-life balance is quite a challenge here, because if you want to make progress in work, men still, unfortunately, don't have to do much, or at least a lot less than women do in that respect. They chit-chat in the kitchen and and they get a job the next day. But this is a real challenge for us, okay? Having, I have 3 kids. Jonathan is 13 and a half, and I have twins who are going to be turning 8 in a week. So I've always had a very difficult time, but on the other hand, I'm quite privileged to have, I have the village, as Hillary Clinton once called it. It takes a village to raise a child. So I actually had my village around me, but not all women have the village to help out. In the army, it's much more of a challenge. On the one hand, all women, well, not all women, most women get drafted to the army when they turn into 18. You can declare that you're religious, and then you will not be drafted, okay? But that is a big question. And the question goes, how many soldiers do you really need? And even in Israel, speaking about the birth rate, it's interesting. You think, how many soldiers do you need? Do you need all of them to volunteer? From my perspective, by the way, one of the tribes, the ultra-Orthodox, that doesn't draft automatically, they're not, it's not so necessary that they would be drafted into the army. It is very necessary that they will be drafted into the employment market. That is crucial. Now, we have nowadays, most of the ultra-Orthodox women are working, a lot of them, by the way, in high tech, and about 40 to 45% of the men are already in the employment market. But the thing is that in the yeshivas they go to, they don't really get literate in mathematics and in English. And that is a barrier that they need to make a leap over it. But they are by the way, they are very talented. Because what you do in yeshiva, if you go to a yeshiva, you, how would you say mitpalpel? You would deliberate. You would deliberate all the time, very heavyweight philosophical questions. And I truly believe in philosophers in the employment market. I think it's very, very important. It moves, innovation a lot of the times come from asking the right questions. So in that sense, when they are drafted into the employment market, they are very, very good, in spite of the barriers that they have to leap over. But the women, since the beginning of the 1990s, we have had to struggle in order to be drafted into the more important positions, and mainly to become fighter pilots in the Navy, not Navy SEALs, but positions on the ships, even in Armored Corps. It's been a struggle. And the thing is that a lot of the women do want to be drafted into meaningful positions. And nowadays we have quite a few fighter pilots. We already have women commanding in the Air Force. There's still a very difficult question. Unfortunately, there was a pilot in the Armored Corps, and to my grief, unfortunately, they decided that the pilot wasn't successful, because now it goes back to the tribes. Because in Israel, all tribes are drafted eventually. And things like chastity and equality clash. For instance, is it okay when a woman, obviously is running around the base because she has to, because that's part of her training, is the question of how she's dressed relevant? All of a sudden, these issues are becoming relevant again because all of the tribes are drafted into the army. So the Israeli army deals with questions no other army in the world has to deal with. Well, it's not so true, because I think transgenders and gays are questions that all of the armies around the world have had to tackle about a decade ago, maybe a decade and a half ago. But we have extra load questions. And one of the things that I would do when I was a member of the Foreign Relations and Security Committee is on a regular basis to make sure that we convene and discuss these issues, because it's amazing that the Israeli Ramatkal, the Israeli Chief of Staff, has to deal with questions like that. So it's fascinating. So does it move gender issues forward, or does it take it back? And the interesting thing is, and that is really the biggest clash, is that the Zionist religions, who are one of the tribes that I mentioned, are becoming more religious. than they used to. And on the other hand, they are very, very good people, and they take very meaningful positions within the army. So their weight, their clout, is much more meaningful than it used to be. So we have had to deal with events that are far from being classic, like a young woman, a young soldier, who is a parachuter's guide, having soldiers turn their back on her. And she spoke to them, and they would have their back turned. Did you hear anything that I said? Well, this is an event that we went through. Now, the thing about these events, that they are taken care of by the army in a very, very harsh way. But how do you deal? That's a very, very meaningful question of command. How do you maintain command to make sure that these specific events that happen because of one specific soldier don't occur? So the army deals with questions of education in regards to gender. And this is in a country where you would probably see, all the women and all the men, sunbathe. This is a very, very free, liberal, especially in Tel Aviv, a very free, liberal country. In Jerusalem, you can see the tribes in a more obvious way. In Tel Aviv, it's not that obvious, even though, by the way, that I live next to a street called Shenkin, which is like hip, it's like, I don't know, what do you define, the mid-district, I don't know, in New York, or a place, where it's hip, where the scene is going on. And we have a yeshiva next door. We have a yeshiva next door, and we've been living with each other for many, many years. No clashes. The yeshiva is like a higher, no, you should ask me, it's okay. It's a school for the ultra-Orthodox. I say yeshiva naturally, but it's not a natural thing for people to know. It's not an obvious thing. It's not, you would be asked on trivia now, you're gonna win the jackpot, but it's a school, a higher school for ultra-Orthodox. That's where they would go usually to be educated. No calculus, no English, okay, in those schools. But it's fascinating, but we live together. Never had any clashes, maybe many 30 years ago maybe, but really not together. We celebrate the holidays, and and this happens in the heart of Tel Aviv. So it is doable. It's just a question of how much you want it to happen. For me, and I should be wrapping up because I want to give you time for questions. For me, it's very obvious that we should be able to do it. That we should be able to go through all these challenges and, become, really use the time, the third opportunity that the Jewish people have to be independent. Because in history, we already unfortunately had twice that we lived here and eventually we were expelled. But in both cases, it was due to inner reasons within the Jewish people. It was also the outside threats, but mostly it's because we had a hard time keeping our unity. That's why it's one of the things that I worked very hard at when I was in Knesset, and I have every intention of continuing to work on it when in civil life, because it's crucial for my children's future, for the future of the children of Israel. And thank you for your attention, and you're so quiet and not an obvious thing in a place like Israel, okay? Now, questions. Please, if you don't mind.
Ma'am, Cadet Martin from the Virginia Military Institute.
Pleasure.
I'm curious, why, in your view and your perspective, why was the Prime Minister not able to create a coalition this time?
I didn't speak much about politics. Oh, sure. Why, in my opinion, wasn't Benjamin Netanyahu being able to form a coalition? Okay, so basically I gave you the answer without speaking about it. It's the tribes. Eventually, it's the tribes. Netanyahu is in the most difficult position he's ever been in personally, in the sense that he's might be indicted in with very serious allegations. In that respect, it's very similar to what's going on in America. American politics is also a bit crazy this past year. So is Israel. And it's hotter here, so we have a better excuse. Eventually, Avigdor Lieberman, who's heading a party that is mostly made up of Israelis who came from the old Soviet Union, was determined not to let him form a coalition. Why did he do that? That's a very interesting question. From my perspective, I think he came to the conclusion that he was the only one who really pushed Netanyahu to being prime minister in 1996. He's the only one who can pull him down. Netanyahu is a very, very talented leader. He should not be the prime minister of Israel anymore. And the answer for that it derives from various reasons. One of which, it's not just the corruption that being associated with him, because from my perspective, it's not only indictments that make behavior not okay. Just being corrupted is it's a public thing. It's how do you behave publicly. And even though he's very, very talented, really one of the best leaders that Israel has had, he is too concerned with his own personal issues, in the sense that he is the one that is polarizing Israel within the tribes. It's very easy when you're right-wing to use rhetorics that is polarizing. Now, this is a choice. I'm, coming from the left, I thought about every word that I wrote in social media, every word that I ever taken out of my mouth when I was giving speeches in the Knesset, because I thought it was crucial to our unity. He's not concerned about it anymore. And I think it's very difficult to be the leader of a place like Israel if you're not concerned about unity anymore. But the clash of the tribes, and with that I will wrap up and go to the next questions. I hope it answers your question. The clash between the Israelis who came from the Soviet Union with the ultra-Orthodox is a very big clash, because he demands that they would serve in the army, and they're saying, we will serve in the army, but in the numbers that we would agree to, okay? So this is, as politics goes, you use your eye and you wink, wink, wink. He decided he doesn't want this wink anymore. And Netanyahu has demanded two other things. He demanded that he would be immune from being indicted in the negotiations. That makes you in a very weak spot. And you can be extorted. Now, the parliamentary system of Israel, where you have about 10 fractions, it's very easy to extort. Bad politics. This is bad politics. Yes. Yes, please.
Cadet Haley Middleton from the United States Military Academy. How does Israel balance the LGBT community and the more religious sectors of the population?
That's what I was talking about, about the subgroups. First of all, sorry. How do we balance in Israel the LGBT community with the ultra-Orthodox? This is like, pow! We just had a gay parade in Jerusalem on Thursday. And unfortunately, 5 years ago, we had a tragedy there. A young girl, 16, who joined a friend, Shira Banki, joined her friend going there, was assassinated by a crazy criminal who decided that she deserves to die because she was joining, I don't know if she was LGBT herself or not, but she was in the parade. This was like, I get the goosebumps when I think about it. A young girl, 16. It's very difficult to balance. The thing is that the LGBT community in Israel is very, very strong politically. Now they have, I think, about 5 members of Knesset, which is an amazing number. One of an LGBT member of community, a friend of mine, Amir Ohana, was appointed Minister of Justice on Thursday. Now this goes back to the question of Netanyahu's ability to maintain a coalition, because he had to wink to the ultra-Orthodox, who are also supposed to be in his next coalition if he forms it, telling them, this is just an interim thing. I need to have someone in the ministry. So this is, after the elections, he won't be there. So it's fascinating. They don't speak to him, by the way. The Orthodox in the Knesset don't speak to Amir Ohana, who is currently the Minister of Justice. They ignore him. They weren't in the session when he joined the Knesset. He joined the Knesset a bit later than we did. And it's still considered to be one of the best places for LGBT communities to come from around the world. You know, the Eurovision proved it, the parades prove it. You know, it's going to be crazy here in Tel Aviv in 2 weeks. I think it is. Is it in 2 weeks? The gay parade? I mean, it's going to be crazy here. Crazy, 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 crazy. Do you know when it is?
Yeah, in 2 weeks.
Shavua haba. No, next week. Okay? So it's gonna be nuts here. In the good sense, by the way. It's gonna be crazy here. But for instance, we have a big question of men's surrogacy. I mean, men using surrogacy services to have children. So I have a friend in the Knesset, Itzik Shmuli, who became a father with surrogate mother from America. But there's a big, it's a big question, again, because there's no separation of religion and state. Again, not having a constitution. Again, the tribe issue, okay? So this is, I don't know, we balance it somehow, but it's very, very difficult. Very difficult. Yes, please.
Any other questions?
Yeah. Okay, I'll go from the back to the front. Yes, please.
Ma'am, Cadet Baker, United States Military Academy. What's your opinion on the ultra-Orthodox not serving in the military right now?
From my perspective, it's not crucial. It's not crucial that they serve in the army. It's crucial that the ones who want, for a lot of them, the army is like an outlet, an easy outlet, not an easy outlet, but a gradual outlet from their communities. That's what scares the leaders of that community, that they should become less religious and ultimately become secular. It happens to a lot of them. I have 2 cousins who have become ultra-Orthodox. They are in one of the specific communities of the ultra-Orthodox, and one of the sons is become secular, and it's a dramatic issue for those families. So from my perspective, the most important thing and the most crucial thing for Israel is that they join the employment market. I've always stood by that position. Worked very, very strongly in order to make sure that they join the market. Much more crucial than joining the army, especially nowadays that we are asking ourselves the questions. For instance, the duty service in Israel, the mandatory service in Israel was shortened. Okay, so you should ask yourself the very difficult question, because for many, many years the army is not just an army. It's a place where all the fractions of Israeli society come together. And it's very, very important also. But is it that crucial? What's more important for Israel eventually? So from my perspective, it's much more important that they join the employment market. Even though then I have a question as to certain communities really holding strongly the duties of the Israeli society, such as joining the army. So let's give them more rights, okay? So let's give those who serve more rights. So I think it's a question we'll still be dealing with in the next coming years. Yes, please.
Ma'am, I'm Isaiah Sampson from the United States Air Force Academy.
Hi, Isaiah.
The employment market and the ultra-Orthodox being a part of it, we've heard from a lot of different speakers that there's a direct correlation between working your military service and your positions in the employment market. So
True.
How do you propose you kind of skip that what seems to be a crucial step right now in society and go from not doing military service to holding positions in the employment market, especially if you give more rights to those who work in the who are doing the military?
Thank you, Isaiah, for a very, very good question. So, the IDF in Israel used to be the golf club. It used to be the golf club. The officers would know each other. They would help each other in the employment market. It's still going on a little bit like that. This is why we don't have our golf club, okay? Nowadays, maybe a little bit more, but we have to create our own golf club. But for many, many years, the IDF was the golf club of employment market in Israel. This is where you would chum up and you would find a new position, and you would go higher and higher. It's a difficult question to answer, but I think more and more, I don't want to say it becomes less important where you served, okay? But a meeting between Israelis would always start with the question, where did you serve in the army, okay? For many, many years, when I was growing up, that was the main question. So where did you serve in the army? I served in intelligence. Okay. For many, many years. It's not as much as it used to be. Okay. Now, still, certain positions, obviously, are, kind of point out on your personality, on your abilities, on your potential. There's no way escaping that. But on the other hand, I think you would hear many more voices like I'm making, trying to find out the solutions that will enhance the Israeli society, not only through the IDF. And obviously what you're asking about is a question of mobility. And question of mobility is not only in the Israeli army, because it would be a question, periphery in Israel is an issue, because connectivity in Israel through public transportation is not that good, not yet. So you have to have a car in order to get to a place of work. So there are many, many, many questions around this specific issue. But I think there are ways to create motivation especially within the employment market, by having employers enjoy certain rights if they have employees from the ultra-Orthodox sector. By the way, this is something, these are things that are being done, or from the Arab community. And that way, you create a different circle and more opportunities. But obviously, it would always be a question in Israel. I think it's going to take many, many years because we're not looking for assimilation. We're looking for somehow everybody maintaining, as I said before, an Israeli salad, everybody maintaining their own culture. By the way, an Israeli employment market, an Israeli working place, willing to have ultra-Orthodox people working in it, has to go through a lot of interchanges. Separate sinks for dairy and meat, a lot of the things, speaking about it with your employees, we're going to have ultra-Orthodox in the company, what should we do? Or having Arabs in the company, da-da-da-da-da-da. It requires a lot of adaptation. And if we educate both the employers and the potential employees as to what we can do together, I think we can, it's going to be a challenge, but we can make the right choice, and we can, I think it can be successful. I think it can be successful eventually. Yes, please.
Right. Cadet Drake from the United States Military Academy. In 1995, the Prime Minister of Israel was killed. How did this highlight different social cleavages within Israeli society, and have we come past that now, in your opinion?
Thank you for a question that would probably wrap up this morning. I started my political life with Yitzhak Rabin. When I was 21 years old, I was drafted by later to be the general director of the Prime Minister's office, Shimon Sheves. I was drafted to work with Yitzhak Rabin in his campaign to be the head of the Labour Party, not just to be Prime Minister. It was before he was elected Prime Minister. I was very privileged to work with a unique leader, very, very unique. He was both personal and shy, and he was very brave. He would go into details. And he had a strategic dream for Israel. He would be concerned with the children of Israel on a daily basis. I think this is the initial drift within the Israeli society, but looking at it, I think it's just a very, very bad peak in the inner relationship, because I don't know if everybody knows, he was assassinated by a young man from the Zionist religion community in Israel. A very bad young man who's still in prison and hopefully will die there. By the way, there is a special legislation in Israel stating that he cannot be released. This is the only personal legislation in Israel. Okay, in Israel, obviously, like in any other place, any democratic country in the world, we do not condone personal legislation. But in this specific case, there is specific legislation, personal legislation. I think it's some of the origins are there. The incitement against the left wing was very, very strong in those days because of the terrorist attacks that were taking place in the cities of Israel. Our dream of having a two-state solution obviously I don't know if it was shattered there, but obviously it was part of it. But it kind of made people think that everything that is left, everything that is associated with the left is bad. And obviously that's not true, because, by the way, Yitzhak Rabin was sure that he has to separate, well, for our own sake, that we should separate from the Palestinians. After the war in 1991, when we had missiles being shot over us from Iraq, he understood that we can't handle that many fronts. You know, you probably learn in your academies, you need to choose your battles, right? You need to know where you stand. So eventually he understood that the most serious battle will be the long haul missiles, which is one of the things that we have to fight on a daily basis because of Iran. In Syria and in Lebanon, they have factories manufacturing missiles that are aimed to alienate, to annihilate Israel. Okay? So, on the one hand, it's very clear that, but this is what he had in mind when going to the Oslo Accords. He wasn't very happy about them, but he thought it would be an interim stage in order to get to maybe, potentially, to a settlement. I think the one thing that we should be working on is the sentiment that everything that is associated with the right is bad and everything associated with the left is bad. It's much more clear coming from the right towards the left in Israel, much less from the left towards the right, but still, Israel is not built for the extremes. This is the one thing that the assassination made it very clear, but not only the assassination. Israel is not built for extreme, not for extreme right, and not for extreme left. It's very, very clear. We should make huge effort to remain in the consensual discussion. It's very difficult to create a consensus, but this is the thing that we should work the hardest for. So I'm very hopeful. By the way, I'm a very optimistic person. I'm a very optimistic person. You can be a politician in Israel and not be optimistic. I'm a very optimistic person. But we're going to have a lot of challenges still going ahead. That's a wrap.
Very much indeed.
Thank you very much.